Just how might Mario or Zelda work with virtual reality? Well, this week we found out with a free update coming to Mario Odyssey and Zelda Breath of the Wild, letting you use the Toy-Con VR goggles as available in the Labo starter kit to let you explore the world, and in the case of Odyssey, play a unique minigame. So the setup is pretty simple. You build the Toy-Con VR goggles yourself, as with all the Labo accessories, and the result is much like Google Cardboard or Gear VR for mobile. In essence, you slide the Switch in there in front of two giant magnifying glasses essentially, which divide the viewpoints of your eyes, and at that point the gyrometer controls take charge for the head tracking, and that leads to results that are not entirely accurate, certainly compared to the higher end spec VR headsets like HTC Vive. It's in a whole different league. This is a typically economical approach from Nintendo, and the fact there's such a low barrier of entry in terms of cost does lead to some obvious limits in terms of what it can do visually and the overall implementation of the VR experiences. So before we get into Zelda or Mario, it's worth noting that the Labo kit includes its own batch of minigames. You get a cartridge which guides you through every step of the building process for every one of the Labo kits, and also the minigames to accompany each. So there are about 9 larger VR games and 16 bite-sized tech demos as well. There are things like baseball, basketball, toy car racing, that sort of thing. Nothing that really amounts to a huge revelation. They're basically small proof of concept ideas that don't really amount to too much more than maybe a 5 to 10 minute play session. The 9 larger VR games require you build an entire Labo accessory, like the Blaster game needs the relevant kit, and there are plenty more like this, and they look a lot better. In terms of visual quality, it's something akin to the Nintendo Land pack-in game from the Wii U days. And helpfully, you also get the option to play it full screen on the Switch's screen, and also then switch in real time to the sort of VR split between the two eyes. So it's very helpful, and you can kind of navigate the menus as you like before slotting it into the goggles. So with all that said, what we got in the last week was a free update for Zelda Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey. And my first port of call really was Zelda, just because the whole idea of exploring Hyrule purely through the headset was very enticing, and it seemed like the more fully fledged implementation of the two. As we'll see later, Mario is more of a dipping of the toe, whereas with Zelda you can play through the whole game. Not that I'd necessarily say you should, but you can play the whole game through the VR headset. Now, firstly and obviously, there is a clear issue. There is no strap on the headset, which means you will need to hold the headset to your face for as long as you want to play. Now, as far as I understand, it's partly a measure to make it more kid-friendly and discourage long play sessions, and so in that respect it's fine for the minigames to have you temporarily hold the goggles to your face, but for something like Zelda, obviously this will start to wear thin. So this is direct capture from the game as played in VR mode. There's a settings toggle just recently added to let you switch over to this, and obviously the resolution takes a hit. The idea is to render 2 images simultaneously, offsetting the viewpoint of each side by a small distance to create a 3D effect. If you'll remember the 3DS days, it's a similar concept, except the division is by the 2 sides of the Switch screen rather than alternating lines. Visually speaking, it's worth stressing that the shadows, geometry and everything in between seem to be a match for playing Zelda while in portable mode, so in terms of the core visual settings, not much is really dialed down. Even the draw distance seems to be the same. What is obviously changed is the resolution. In order to render 2 viewpoints, they had to dial something back, and that is very evident right away, especially since you're holding the glasses right to your face. In terms of metrics, this is obviously quite tricky because there's a lens distortion on the 2 sides, which warps the 2 viewpoints into a position where it can then resolve properly with the goggles. But to my pixel testing, you are essentially getting a 480p image in the center of the screen, so 854 by 480. But the twist is, Towards the edges of these circles, you get a 1280 by 720 level of image quality. So towards the periphery, it's 720p. Towards the center, where the iris will be focusing on, it's 480p. So this goes against a lot of the logic we've seen in other VR implementations. Certainly Nvidia has a mode for VR on PC where you get a culling of resolution towards the edges of the screen while the focus of the detail is in the center. So it's the complete opposite of that. To my mind, the reason Nintendo's gone this way is perhaps because the lenses push the image closer to the eye towards the edges, whereas in the center it's further away, and so there's less resolution needed there. Or alternatively, it's because the image is distorted and twisted to a point where all the pixels kind of concentrate towards the edges. Either way, you will notice immediately the drop off in image quality compared to portable play, for example, where we had a dynamic resolution from 1152 by 648 up to 720p, but obviously that applied across the screen as a whole, so it is obviously a downgrade in that sense. Now I've noticed the FMV sections, the pre-rendered cutscenes, which are kind of very deftly integrated into the game right at the start, run at closer to native res per eye. They look much sharper, but the downside is they are widescreen and less interactive in terms of the 3D effect, and you certainly can't look around during them. You've got a fixed position, almost like you're in an auditorium watching a film. There's also some setbacks in terms of the playability, because the map elements are just removed outright from the on-screen HUD. You need to go look in the menus to get your bearings, and then you go back out again, and then you can orientate yourself and then walk towards the direction you need to go in. So really it's not as convenient as I thought it'd be, and in terms of playing it, to be honest, I didn't really have a very good time either. The main reason for that is the camera, and I think most people who will play this will agree. The logic behind controlling the camera using your head movements just doesn't make a lot of sense. Now in VR terms, the goal really is always to make sure there's no disconnect between your head movement and the movement in game. The approach for Zelda though is at complete odds with that. So say you'll look left, you're actually going to move the camera around Link. It's completely fixed on his position in the world, and so it's more like they've mapped the traditional analog camera movement around Link to just your head movement. So if you look up, you'll have the camera swerve to near Link's feet and look upwards. Really what should have happened here is we should have seen some sort of first person view mode where you could directly map your head movements to what goes on screen. Instead, we've got this awkward setup. And now, there is an alternative here. You can turn off the gyrometer controls entirely and carry on using the right analog stick. You obviously hold the Joy-Cons either side of your face as you play, and you can kind of control it that way and just get the 3D effect. But at that point, it doesn't feel like it's really worth the effort, and I must say, motion sickness is an issue with this one, more so than most VR games I've ever played, just because of the disconnect, the latency you get with the gyro controls. There's only so far they can really get the latency down when it's relying on such a tiny sensor inside the Switch itself. And on top of that, you've got the blurry image quality as well, which is probably the least of this mode's worries. The alternative approach is with Mario Odyssey, which instead of integrating it into the game, has a kind of optional side mode. You can watch a couple of the cutscenes, like the opening and outro, all in-engine, and these are delivered in kind of an auditorium view, where you're sat back like you would be in a cinema, and you watch these cutscenes in 3D. More than anything, this reminded me of the 3DS era. It feels like they've pushed the 3D slider all the way to max in these scenes, which is great. You get a great sense of the depth and the proportion of the characters as they move about. Now for the actual playable parts, you get 3 worlds basically, and they all unlock as you play through the game. So obviously you start with the Cappy Kingdom, and once you finish that you get the VR mode equivalent. It's a bit of a letdown, but in terms of the mechanics it's far more comfortable, because they get the basic thing right of fixing the camera to one spot and letting you turn around a full 360 degrees to see where Mario goes in this area. And the whole point of it is you're collecting instruments hidden around the world and delivering them to the according musician, and once you've done that, you move over and you've finished the game. There are a few transitions, you can kind of work your way up to a secret area, then the camera will cut and you can see around a new spot, but besides that you're fixed to one spot and looking around this kingdom. So nothing too advanced, and compared to Zelda, there's not a heck of a lot to talk about. Now in terms of resolution, it's actually using the same setup as Zelda as well, so you get a 480p-esque image right in the center, and towards the periphery it's more like 720p. That actually does hamper gameplay a little bit, because obviously being rooted to the spot, you're going to see Mario run all the way to the distance, and you've got to be able to distinguish him by a few pixels. So to help with that, you are actually given a way to zoom in like a telephoto lens all the way across the map just to where Mario is, but it's still a bit of a nuisance. And to be honest, I wish I could have moved my viewpoint to another fixed position across the map to see what Mario was doing over there. Still, it's worth emphasizing it is a free update, and in that sense, you haven't really lost anything by checking this out. Nintendo has just kind of dipped their toes in the water to see what's possible. But definitely there's a sense Mario Odyssey gets this right in so many ways where Zelda gets this wrong. And a key part of that is in the performance stakes, because much like the main game, Mario Odyssey runs at 60 frames per second despite being split to two viewpoints. And that pays off hugely in terms of reducing the sense of motion sickness, and giving both eyes a regular refresh completes the illusion that everything you're seeing is real. It's a clear line, 60 FPS all the way, which is not by any means what we got in Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now for the original game, obviously in portable mode you get a range between 20 to 30 FPS, certainly as you look down the initial hill as you come up from the starting point of the game, and also venturing into the woods. That also carries over to the VR experience, sadly, which is a nightmare, and you'll notice it right away when it's pushed right against your eyes. You've got the full lateral movement of your head to look around and feel that. Worse still, by dividing the two viewpoints, you do seem to get worse performance than you would in portable play. Even when it's running at a flat 30 FPS, it's not comfortable, but when it drops to 20, it's pretty much a write-off. My main takeaway of playing VR on Switch is that the best experiences are 60 FPS with a fixed camera viewpoint, and generally playing games in small bursts as well. Mario Odyssey definitely ticks these three boxes, and a lot of the minigames included in the box also seem to get that right as well. But more than anything, I think the actual act of building the VR goggles themselves, the Toy-Con VR goggles, was more fun than the actual payoff. Just putting the card together and ending up with a new peripheral was satisfying just in itself, whereas the VR experiences were a bit nausea-inducing and not exactly refined to a point where you could imagine playing the whole game this way, certainly not in Zelda's case. But hopefully this has given Nintendo a moment to reflect on what works and what doesn't between all the approaches they've taken, and maybe, just maybe, we'll see more games try to utilize this. And certainly I'd love to see a game like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe get a similar vote of support, where you can just jump into the cockpit view and then kind of look around as you drive. But that's all from me today. If you did find this analysis useful in any way, please do give us a like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell to get notifications as any video lands. Also, we have this video on our Patreon at